Before we begin the main topic of our talk today, just a few words to recap what we've talked about last week. So, last week we've talked about sankhara versus the deathless, or another way of putting it would be craving versus nibbana. Now, in Buddhism, we are familiar with the adage that craving is the root cause of suffering. And there's a tendency to define craving as generic greed, meaning something like greed for money, greed for fame, and so on and so forth. And as we've discussed, craving actually points to something much more primal in nature and a lot more subtle in form. Very specifically, it is this almost perennial thirst on the part of the mind to be something, to become something, to chase down new experiences, to adhere to and become coupled with sankharas or activities in certain ways. And there is something fundamentally pathological, there's something fundamentally unsettling about this way of existence. Because there's really no true peace, there's no true rest, there's no true arrival. There's only this obsessive adherence to sankhara. You're always in the process of becoming something, you're always in the process of chasing down something, and that your well being is very precariously tied up with these fleeting and ultimately unreliable modes that are brought together by activities. Now, the topic of the day is recognizing the nature of jhana. And the nature of jhana is directly tied to what we just said about craving, what we talked about last week with regards to nibbana. Nowadays, well, actually not nowadays, but for probably 2,000 years, um, this idea of jhana, this idea of samadhi, has been rendered almost exclusively as concentration, as a sort of exercise in attentional training. You're fixing the mind on some neutral object, like the breath, like a body part, such as your navel, such as the third eye area, perhaps a mantra, perhaps a Buddha's name, and so on and so forth. And as far as we can tell in the suttas, samadhi really, or jhanas, or quote unquote concentration, has nothing to do with any of the above, but instead it's intimately tied to what we just said about sankhara, about craving. Now, a very compact thesis on what early Buddhist meditation ultimately is about could be summed up in the following way. It is about steadying your mind in the direction of the deathless, and then learning to enjoy the happiness, the pleasure, the peace that results from your increasingly becoming decoupled from sankharic fever. So as this fevered involvement in sankhara diminishes, as you become more fully cognizant about the stress, about the limitation, about the dangers of being involved in sankhara in such a way, there's a cooling down effect. And concomitant to this cooling down effect is, perhaps in the beginning, a sense of happiness, very specifically the happiness in the discovery of this new direction, the discovery of a new possibility, other than this feverish entanglement with sankhara. There's a happiness of having discovered a way to tap into a much more easeful, much more accessible source of pleasure and peace. So that's really what happiness of jhana is about. In the same similar vein, pleasure in jhana is very specifically about how, as a result of your mind having become unburdened, becoming secluded from the said sankharic fever, there's a general ease, there's a general relaxation, there's a general composure, there's a general pleasure to be had at a tactile level. And that is what pleasure in jhana is primarily about. So instead of thinking of jhana as a state of absorption, as a state of concentration brought on by your focusing your mind at the tip of your nose, or focusing the mind at a mantra, focusing your mind at the Buddha's name, and so forth, it is much more useful and, in fact, more consistent with scriptural accounts to think of jhanas as steadying yourself on the path of seclusion, disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, and letting go. So, firstly, we have frequently come across suttas that speak of first jhana as quote-unquote seclusion-born pleasure. In other words, it's a pleasant abiding. It's a pleasurable place for the mind to be at, which results from quote-unquote seclusion, as opposed to a result of your focusing your mind, you're fixing your mind a certain way. And once again, just to remind you, the word seclusion means that you are, say for example, softening your attachment to sankharic fever, that you're not as feverishly involved in sankharic activities as before. Perhaps there is a recognition of danger. Perhaps there's a deliberate turning your back on sankharic fever. Perhaps there is a greater tapping into of the ease, of the peace that comes from letting go, from relinquishing the burdens you've been carrying as a result of being involved in sankhara in such a heavy way. That's what seclusion is about. And so, once again, the happiness, the confidence, the inspiration, the comfort, the ease, the relaxation, the sense of peace, any of those things becoming the primary source of your entertainment, becoming the primary source of your nutriment, that is the way jhana is brought about. This is what is referred to as seclusion-born pleasure. Failing to understand this, one would go about dabbling in all sorts of attention fixation techniques, trying to fix your mind, fix your mind on the breath, follow the breath in a certain way, staring at a spot, staring at an image a certain way. But then you are likely to find out that whatever exotic psychophysical episodes you ended up experiencing, And it's actually a rare phenomena to even experience them in the first place. But even if you do, they hardly fit the suttas' descriptions of jhana. The suttas talk about how people entered into jhana when they listened to sermons on dispassion, when they listened to sermons on seclusion, when they listened to sermons concerning the impermanence, the unreliability of sankhara, right? And the resulting seclusion attitude, the resulting sentiment about seclusion leads to a jhanic state. The suttas talked about how contentment, how recollection about your virtue, how this general inclination of the mind toward the Dhamma gives you inspiration, gives you gladness, and that gladness transmutes into comfort, into bodily ease. Right? So in the suttas, we mostly encounter descriptions of jhanas that do not fit the traditional, the mainstream account of how samadhi is to be developed. Just to refresh our memory, let's look at some of the key terms that frequently occur in the context of jhana. And hopefully, in the process of elucidating the meaning of these terms, we will arrive at a clear understanding of the nature of jhana. So firstly, there's the word sankharas, which we talked about at great length, right? And one way of understanding sankharas would be your passionate adherence to, or your delighting in the involvement with activities. And then there's the term sensuality, kamma. Right? In the suttas, we are under the impression that jhanas, or these samadhi states, they are the direct result of your having turned your back on sensuality, having become secluded from sensuality. And a useful way of understanding sensuality is that it is the most passionate mode of sankharas, right? Of all the different ways you can become attached, you can have craving for sankharas. Sensuality is the grossest form. Now, the Buddha teaches that there are many subtle forms of attachment to sankhara, including identification with the five aggregates. But then the grossest of all attachment to sankhara can be understood as sensuality. The sensuality is frequently described in the suttas as involving, quote unquote, householders' resolves and memories. What that means is things like your passion, your conviction about building up family relations, about hoarding materials, about aggrandizing your fame. And very specifically, it has to do with your lust for the pleasure connected with other human beings. Right? Your lust connected with developing loving sexual relations with other human beings. And the different states of jhanas are increasingly more refined ways of turning your back on feverish involvement in sankhara. So the threshold, the gateway to jhana, is also your having let go of, your having secluded from the grossest form, the grossest way you can become involved with sankhara. It's grossest because it costs you the greatest amount of energy. It costs you the greatest amount of mental scheming and planning. It entails the greatest amount of worry, the greatest amount of competition. And in comparison to the non-sensual forms of pleasure, sensual pleasure is the most cost-benefit ineffective, right? You need to exert yourself most stressfully for what really are the most fleeting, superficial, unfulfilling types of stimulation. Moving on to still another term, seclusion, right? We've talked about this. This is decoupling from adherence to and delight in activities, turning away from or softening of the adherence to and delight in activities. This might involve, at the level of your attitude, there's a resolve, there's a conviction about how you're not going to allow yourself to indulge in sankharic fever, that you will not allow yourself to take sankharic fever, to take craving as your only refuge. And this may involve at a muscular level. You're actively putting aside, you're actively turning back on, you're actively eradicating, say, your dependency, your addiction, your clinging to this mode of behavior. And here I am repeating myself. So what is seclusion-born pleasure? It is the ease, completeness, contentment, well-being, comfort, release, and so on and so forth, in having some measure of seclusion from sankharas. In other words, to train yourself in jhanas, you're primarily not dabbling in attentional fixation exercise, and how to stare at your nose tip and how to count your breath. Right? It's nothing about concentrating on a neutral object, but rather it's about steadying your attitude in seclusion. It's about steadying your sense of direction. It's about your training yourself to tap into the ease, completeness, contentment, so on and so forth, right? That comes from cooling down your fire, so to speak. And jhanic happiness, otherwise known as piti, right, can be understood as the confidence in, inspiration about this new direction, discovery, the joy that is based in the knowledge that you now have the key to a secure form of well-being and peace, or at least a relatively secure form of well-being and peace. And really, happiness is icing on the cake, and the cake is peace. And so happiness is less important and transitory, but happiness, transitoriness is not a problem because the mind is anchored in something more durable, such as peace and contentment. Let me unpack these words a little more. Now, if we're talking about carnal happiness, happiness that has nothing to do with jhana, right? Ordinary worldly types of happiness, there is always a certain sense of insecurity with regards to these episodes of happiness. Whenever we're experiencing happiness, there is a all too poignant awareness that this is going to fade, that this is going to pass. And the passing of happiness equals disappointment, equals unfulfillment, equals depression. Right? So this is the typical way beings operate in the world. without some active presence of happiness, there is depression, there's disappointment, there is this sense of lack. Now, jhanic happiness, though it's also episodic in nature, it's transitory. It is much more fleeting than the other jhanic symptoms. There is much less insecurity involved. In fact, you can argue that there's no insecurity involved. And jhanic happiness, when it passes, it doesn't go into disappointment. Instead, it transmutes into deeper peace. It transmutes to contentment. And so that even as you're experiencing happiness, you do so with the full knowledge that there is always something better awaiting, or there's always something better undergirding this happiness. And this is why happiness in jhana is like icing on the cake. And there's no sense of insecurity, there is no clinginess on your part, this need to hold on to it, to spend a lot of energy safeguarding it, and with this implicit fear on your part about the imminent loss of it. Moving on to jhanic pleasure. It's the comfort, ease, pleasure brought on when the body is not burdened, agitated by the grossest kind of sankharic passion. Now, you may not be aware of this, but if you exclusively live in the sankharic realm, if you exclusively live in the sensual realm, you are almost always beset by stress. You're almost always beset by a pervasive sense of being competition, that you're not doing enough, that you're not good enough, that you need to do more, that you need to always engage in a sort of transactional behavior to trade well-being with some very strenuous exertion on your part. Throughout the day, we are high-strung, perhaps without your knowing this at all, because you're so habituated to this. Throughout the day, your body is assaulted by, it's gnawed at by these subtle stressors, this, eternal competitive mode, this eternal safeguarding mode. And when you very deliberately try to let go, when you very deliberately try to pacify the said stressors as you distance yourself from sankharic involvement, as we've explained, then you will begin to discover that there's a sort of pleasure to be had that is a direct product of relaxation. Right? And this relaxation is not just a simple act of, say, easing up a tightened muscle. By relaxation, I mean like psychologically, physically, there's a letting go. Right? There is a letting go of fear. There's a letting go of deep-seated insecurity. And in fact, for some people, it is experienced as an active presence of confidence, this fearlessness, this knowledge that your basis, your foundation is something much more secure, much more durable than what sensuality can afford, than what sankharas can afford. So that's the pleasure that potentially can be had as a result of developing jhana. With regards to piti, sukha, with regards to jhanic happiness, to jhanic pleasure, and so forth, most meditation teachers will explain them as very specific episodes and would require you to conform to certain standards, very strict standards about the intensity of said happiness and pleasure. Some teachers will tell you that, well, there are only certain types of happiness, certain types of pleasure that will qualify, that will count as jhanic piti sukha. And they have to be mind-blowing in the following way. Or you have to be rendered ecstatic. You are enraptured, or that you are experiencing a high that is more intense, than say sexual climax. Only such piti sukha count. Now, if you hold such expectations about happiness and pleasure, you will find that it is defeating the purpose of just allowing yourself to focus on the more important issues, the important issues of whether or not you're secluding yourself from unwholesome qualities, whether or not you are learning to content your mind, whether or not you're learning to pacify level of feverishness on your part. A much more useful approach would be, instead of trying to measure the amount of happiness, pleasure you have, or you can potentially have, that you want to have, think of happiness and pleasure as open-ended things. They can be quite subtle. They may appear quite insignificant, especially in the beginning. But if you were to approach these seemingly insignificant symptoms with a transformed attitude, with a constructive attitude, very specifically the attitude of recognizing what they are, and therefore appreciating, admiring, cherishing them, developing confidence in them, right? Deliberately allowing yourself to more wholeheartedly savor them, right? To tap into them with the purpose of further inclining your mind toward the deathless, right? If you do so, then what started out as insignificant will be savored in such a way that they become enveloping, that they become satisfying, that they become fulfilling, that they can become something that saturate your whole being. And by open-ended, I mean, so for examples, with regards to jhanic happiness, what will count as jhanic happiness? Say if you are deriving any sense of inspiration from listening to this talk, right, by attending to an aspect of the Dhamma, right, this inspiration, look at it. What is it doing to your mind? It is inspiring your mind in almost palpably sizzling fashion. Right? You can feel that, perhaps not in any dramatic way, but then your spirit is made uplifted a little bit, perhaps. Perhaps there is a refreshingness you can detect in your spirit. Perhaps there is an elevated level of confidence. Anything that uplifts the mind in any palpable way, however insignificantly, however subtly. Anything that would brighten up your mind so that your sense of direction is made clear, right? And that you feel more committed to the path. That would count as happiness. And for this reason, the suttas give us examples such as, using, like drawing happiness from metta, from goodwill, right? Drawing happiness from devotion, from gratitude, from contentment, from Dhamma-inspired sentiments. In the same way too, jhanic pleasure should be looked upon as open-ended, as having a wide spectrum of possibility. Right? So even if it's for a second's worth, you notice that you softened your fever, you've softened your tight grip on sensuality, and there is a tiny bit but detectable relaxation. This is something you can work on. This is called jhanic pleasure. It is discernibly different than the previous tension. It is discernibly different than the tight grip that you're experiencing just a moment ago. Now, I'm not saying that jhanic happiness and pleasure will forever remain so seemingly insignificant. There is, of course, a possibility that they might turn into or be developed deliberately into something really dramatic, something mind-blowing, so to speak. But you don't really need to have these things to be mind-blowing, to be of a certain intensity, for them to have the power to engross the mind. All it takes really is for you to have a different attitude toward them, to know what is contentment, so that even a little bit of happiness, even a little bit of pleasure is sufficient to occupy your attention, is sufficient to nurture you. This becomes your preoccupation. This becomes, the source of your present entertainment. And because you know how to cherish it, because you are appreciating it with this mindset. So even seemingly insignificant things can become very transformative. It can potentially have an effect on your whole being. So one way of defining jhanas would be the steadying of one's disenchantment, seclusion, dispassion, and cessation in relations to sankharas. I'm hoping that you will be able to walk away from today's class with a new understanding that jhanas is not a practice in a separate compartment from the main cardinal teachings of the Buddha. Right? The main cardinal teachings, such as the Four Noble Truths, for example, right? The truth about suffering, right? Very specifically, it's about this pathological entanglement with sankhara that we talked about, the stress, the instability, the unfulfillment, the dangers that are inherent in existing in such a way, in being 100% consumed by and swept away by sankharas. That's what suffering is about. And cause of suffering is about this thirst, this primal craving, right? The sankharic involvement. And then there's the truth about cessation of suffering. And really, there are different degrees of cessation of suffering. And jhanas is one form of cessation of suffering. And a measure of jhana is a measure of cessation of suffering, is a measure of seclusion from the cause of suffering. And then you will experience a corresponding measure of peace and freedom from suffering. And so really, the pleasure you're experiencing in jhana, they're not really technically objects of potential attachment as most meditation teachers make them out to be. They are hints of nibbana. Right? The peace, the happiness, the pleasure, and so forth, the well-being that you experience in jhana, they're hints. As you get closer to nibbana, once again, that is defined as extinction of thirst, so that you no longer are reflexively tying yourself up with sankharas via passion. Right? That's really how nibbana is defined in the suttas. And let's say if you are able to do so, say 10%, assuming that these arbitrary numeric figures can be applied to such an effort, then you will experience 10% of corresponding peace. And the peace is doing what very specifically? It's not just a mere enjoyment, even though it is. it is also confirming your sense of direction. It's giving you feedback. It's telling you that you're heading in the right direction. It is telling you that, hey, greater, more reliable, and even less effortful source of peace and happiness is in this direction. And in the same vein of thought, how do we understand jhanic progression? Very specifically, how do we understand the way to move from first jhana to second jhana to third jhana to fourth jhana? Or in fact, from no jhana to first jhana? The jhanic progression is defined by your loosening your grip on subtler forms of sankharas. Second jhana is pleasure born of quietude and of tapping into happiness more fully. Third jhana is pleasure born of having pacified happiness. Right? You're having to rely on happiness. You're having to feed off of happiness. Fourth jhana is pleasure born of equanimity toward all sankharas. Right? It's peace that is present, regardless the absence or presence of happiness and other phenomena. So by dropping even more passionate adherence to sankharas and by dropping subtler activities, one experiences greater peace, i.e. higher jhanas. Following the same logic, the threshold of jhana is crossed not by attentional fixity or focus on a tiny spot. It is crossed when you recognize the stress in sankharic passion, sankharic tight grip, and moving in the direction of the deathless, unfabricated peace. A lot of meditation teachers would diagnose whether you have entered into jhana or not by ways of looking at how frozen your mind has become, by ways of looking at how greatly suspended your sensory operations have become. And so according to many of these commentary-inspired traditions, as opposed to suttas-inspired traditions, people would define jhana as a state where there's no visual experience, there's no auditory experience, right? Or at least that, said sensory experiences are greatly suppressed. This is how they understood sensuality. But as I have pointed out, that's not how the suttas define sensuality. Sensuality is not sensory operation. Sensuality is your passionate involvement in sensual pleasure. And so the threshold of jhana is attained by cooling down your fire once again. Okay? It's not about how frozen or how exclusive your attentional focus has become. And so, understanding this, we should realize that the way to develop jhana is to do the following. Number one, to help yourself recognize the stress of sankharic passion, turning away from it, becoming more disenchanted toward it. The suttas offer us many different angles in explaining this fact. Some suttas talked about developing a greater awareness of the drawbacks in sensuality. What sort of drawbacks are there in sensuality? Just as a way of explaining our point, sensuality requires a lot of exertion on your part. All right, let's use sensual, sexual, romantic relations as our example. Right, you need to give heed to things like your hairdo, your sense of fashion, right? Your mannerism, your gait, the way you dance, so on and so forth. They convey how viable of a reproductive partner you can be. You need to craft your sense of humor in a very, oftentimes in a very deliberate and contrived way, not in a happy, spontaneous way. And you're recognizing that sensual pleasure is very much like the way hummingbirds feed. They dart about busily. Right? Yes, nectar is very sweet. It's very enticing. But then with the busily darting about, you only get a brief moment's worth of sweetness. And then that pleasure quickly exalts itself, and you need to resume your flight. You need to continue on to the next object and the next object. There is no abiding, there is no rest, there is no lasting and steady, uninterrupted fulfillment. There's a constant interruption because that's how short lived sensual pleasures are. And so every time your pleasure is interrupted, you are left wanting and you are driven. And in the course of the day, a hummingbird spends more time being driven than being able to settle into enjoyment. So that's the nature of sensuality. The more you think about it, the more you pay attention to this fact, right, the more disenchantment, the more seclusion in attitude you'll be able to develop, the more you're willing to see that renunciation is indeed rest, like what the Buddha said. The more you're willing to settle down into a more efficient mode. The second thing you're really doing in developing jhana is to recognize the ease and pleasure of letting go sankharic passion and steep in and dwell within it, becoming more confident and familiar with the flavor that is hinting at nibbana. I like to think of the Buddha's way of teaching meditation as involving many behavioral principles. And as many psychobehaviorists have pointed out, the most effective, the most robust way of changing your habit is to simultaneously develop a pull and a push, right? So a push is something that propels you away from the bad habit you want to kick. And a pull is the good thing, the good rewards that are pulling you away from said bad habit. Jhana works the same way too, according to the suttas. On the one hand, you want the push, which is development of seclusion, development of turning your back on sensuality, becoming more aware of the drawbacks, of the stress, the limitations in sensuality. And then on the other hand, you also want to develop the pull, which is your recognizing how harmless jhanic happiness and pleasure can be, how fulfilling, how steady, how comparatively reliable, how conducive they are to your becoming even more liberated as a result of enjoying such pleasure. And according to the suttas, you don't just practice non-striving, you don't practice non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. You are striving in a very deliberate way. You want to develop confidence in this new dimension. You want to familiarize yourself with this new dimension. You want to cultivate a discernment that is based on being able to compare the different qualities that are found in different modes of behavior. Right? Sensuality is of this quality. Jhana is of this other quality. Why are they different? Why is one so much more preferred than the other? And contrary to what popular opinions say about how you should avoid jhanic pleasure lest you become attached to it, the suttas actually encourage us to develop it. Right? In fact, there are a number of suttas that talk about how your fear of jhanic pleasure would prevent you from robustly developing jhanas. The suttas instruct us to welcome such pleasure, for that its development leads to a better sense of directionality. Right? The more you are able to recognize and tap into jhanic pleasure, the more you will understand how nibbana is unfabricated. If there's a difference that can be said about nibbana and jhana, that would be jhana still entails a subtle form of exertion, right? A subtle involvement in sankhara, whereas nibbana doesn't. Nibbana is a complete uprooting of thirst. And so you no longer need to link up with experience in such a way. You no longer need to extract pleasure from experience because you're driven by hunger. Whereas in jhana, that craving and thirst is not completely removed. All that you've managed to do is that you succeeded in drawing sustenance from a more efficient source of pleasure. But then in doing so, you get a sense that with the more letting go, with the more cooling down the fire, with the further withdrawal from your passionate involvement in sankhara, you're getting closer to nibbana. You're getting closer at completely removing this primordial addiction, this primordial need to depend on experiences. And here I am showing you some sutta passages reaffirming what we have just explained. MN 66, I'm quoting, jhana is called renunciation pleasure, seclusion pleasure, calm pleasure, self-awakening pleasure. And of this pleasure, I say that it is to be cultivated, to be developed, to be pursued, that it is not to be feared. Anguttara Nikaya 9.41 teaches us to leap up at renunciation, to grow confident, to become steadfast and firm, seeing it at peace. You see how this is different than the popular instruction, non-striving, non-judgmental, just living the present moment. Buddhist jhanas are teleological, meaning that they're goal-oriented. Yes, in aiming for your goal, you can learn to decrease the way you strenuously strive. You can learn to become more effortless in your way of striving. But this doesn't detract from the fact that Buddhist meditations have aims. And in fact, it's frequently useful to think of these aims as long-term, mid-term, short-term. That a skilled meditator should line up his or her short-term goal with his or her mid-term goal, and that in turn with the long-term goal. And one of the things you can do to behaviorally reinforce yourself in the right direction is to learn to leap up at renunciation, to feel inspired, to in fact feel excited about the idea of renunciation. And renunciation is defined precisely as secluding yourself from sensuality. You want to develop confidence in this. And the way you develop confidence in this is by doing, say for example, increasingly seeing that jhanic peace is more reliable than sensual pleasure. Right? To help convince your mind that this is a better way of being. That seclusion or renunciation is not a matter of deprival. It's not a matter of just denying yourself pleasure so that you ended up being a pure ascetic. You want to convince your mind, you want to help your mind see that you are allowing it to have access to a more pervasive, more all-rounded, more fulfilling type of well-being than the hummingbird mode can provide. And you want to grow steadfast and firm in it, so that initially as you practice, you might get some moments worth of jhanic experience. Right? There is this short, brief moment where you go, this is called relaxing. This is called loosening up my grip. This is called being more aware of the stress, the exertion in sensuality. But then you allow those brief moments to increase. Right? You apply mindfulness, clear comprehension, ardency, right? This keen interest. And weaving together more of those jhanic moments so that you can virtually call your entire life as being jhanic in momentum, as being jhanic in nature. And when you lead such a lifestyle, you are a renunciant. And a renunciant has access to renunciant joy, to renunciant pleasure. The most ideal way to get into jhana is not by your playing with certain attentional tricks, not by counting or following the breath in a certain way, but to develop a renunciant lifestyle according to the teachings of the Eightfold Noble Path, according to the teaching of the seven factors of awakening, right? And once you've established this renunciant lifestyle, this jhanic lifestyle, all it takes is for you to have a moment's worth of leisure. And in this leisurely moment, you can let yourself go. You can more wholeheartedly savor the well-being that permeates in this lifestyle. And that's jhana. That's how you develop jhana. The Buddha never speaks of jhana as an independent concentration, calm shamatha type of training, divorced from the life context, divorced from the Eightfold Noble Path context. Jhana in Buddhism is always ethical in nature. It is not about developing concentration on neutral object. Jhana is always ethical in nature. It's always teleological in nature. It's always about your knowing what is quality, what is not quality. You're inclining more toward that which is of higher quality. You're weaning yourself off, becoming less dependent on that which is of poor quality. Here's another sutta from Anguttara 5.200, and I'm quoting. There is a case where the mind of a monk, when tending to sensual pleasures, doesn't leap up at sensual pleasures, doesn't grow confident, steadfast, or released in sensual pleasures. But when attending to renunciation, his mind leaps up at renunciation, grows confident, steadfast, and released in renunciation. When his mind is rightly gone, rightly developed, has rightly risen above, gained release, and become disjoined from sensual pleasures, and whatever fermentations, torments, and fevers there are that arise in dependence on sensuality, he is released from them. This is the key to going into jhana. So when you're faced with sensual pleasure, you don't leap up, you don't get excited about it. Unlike ordinary untrained people who harbor fantasies about sensual craving, whose life's refuge is in developing, investing in sensual obsession. You don't leap up at it. You don't grow confident in it. You don't allow yourself go in the direction of sensual craving. But instead, you become excited, you become confident, you become steadfast at renunciation, right? At secluding yourself from sensuality. And as you can see clearly from the sutta, the peace, the pleasure, and so forth that arise, they are not the result of your fixing your attention in a certain way. They're not concentration induced. The pleasure and peace are induced because the fermentations, torments, and fevers that are there in the sensual mode are absent in your lifestyle, or at least in this brief moment. And in this brief moment, you can detect the ease, the completeness, the fulfillment, the confidence, the clarity that comes from that moment's worth of freedom. A few tips. When you practice, don't worry whether you've entered into first jhana or if this counts as a second jhana. Don't go about telling other people, oh, you are a jhana attainer. Right? Don't worry about whether you've entered the threshold. But instead, focus on the properties and activities, the specific properties and activities at any moment, in any mode of activity you find yourself in. And you can ask yourself, are they jhanic in nature, conducing to jhana, or are they hindrances to jhanic release? Right? So to give you an example, right? So at this moment, you recognize that there's a lot of, say, maybe boredom on your part. And then you allow yourself to become more content. You help yourself see that boredom is not due to a lack of entertainment primarily. Boredom is due to your resisting and your being discontent at this particular moment. Boredom has to do with the specific ways you are struggling against the present moment. It is a sankharic involvement you're in that is perpetuating the sense of boredom. Whenever you find yourself engaged in some activity, right, you can always ask yourself, well, is this leading to greater contentment or not? Am I allowing craving to proliferate? Or am I allowing myself to be nourished more by peace, by contentment? Is my life sustained by a Dhammic purpose so that I can stay inspired? Not necessarily like red-blooded, hot-headed mode inspired. But then you can feel that throughout the day, you're buoyed by a sense of purposiveness, that you stay Dhammically inspired. There is a confidence on your part, knowing that you are doing arguably the noblest, the worthiest thing in life, saving your mind, saving your soul, purifying your activities, learning to gain the happiness of the highest quality. And then as you do this, you can then follow the instruction provided by Anguttara 5.28, which is to take whatever modest measure of jhanic moments you develop and to ensure that they envelop more part of your being, to permeate, to saturate, so that there is less and less interruption in your life. in the way you're being sustained and nurtured by the Dhamma. You can feel that your life is just, in general, developing in the direction of more brightness, more well-being, more judiciousness, discernment. There are more facets, more aspects of your life that are informed, that are inspired, that are shaped by Dhammic instructions. And so that when you rest, when you go to sleep, there's hardly regret. There's no fear. Right? There is this determination about which direction you're going. And that you'll find yourself frequently at ease. You'll find your body frequently unagitated. You'll find your spirit frequently inspired. You'll find your mind frequently immersed in clarity. You'll find your mind frequently nurtured by good kinds of nutrients, not junk food. Then entering into jhana, it's really become a matter of formality. It's just your straightening up your back, finding a moment of leisure. Or perhaps you don't even need to straighten your back. You can just lie down and relax and just really let yourself go undistractedly so that you're wholeheartedly dedicated to the task. The task of developing disenchantment, or the task of tapping into inner peace, and so on and so forth. That's how jhanas are attained. So don't preoccupy yourself with these so-called concentration tricks. Right? People teaching you how to stare in a certain way, how to produce counterpart image, how to smile in a certain way, how to focus in a spot in the body. The tricks in winning jhana is in the Buddha's teaching of the 7 factors of awakening, is in the Buddha's teaching of the 4 Noble Truths, is in the teaching of the Eightfold Noble Path. Right? To use the Eightfold Noble Path as our example, a right view is most frequently defined as your proper understanding of what is dispassion, what is the deathless, right? What is the cause of suffering, and so forth. Right resolve means you're having firm resolve, a determination in heading down in that direction, leading yourself to the deathless. Right speech is really about speaking in such a way so that your right view, your right resolve are not compromised. Right? You speak, in addition to speech of necessity, also speech that is conducive to dispassion, a speech that is conducive to an ambiance of ease, or an ambiance of Dhammic inspiration, contentment, and so forth. Right? And altogether, when the Eightfold Noble Path is steadied so that it becomes your mainstay, this is the way you live your life, then you are just one foremost step away from entering into jhana. And so in such a way, jhanas are not training in calm or concentration, as most modern meditation teachers would tell you. It is not merely a prerequisite to some insight training. Jhanas are holistically the steadying of the entire Dhammic project. And let me conclude this talk with just a few more sutta passages. And Men 139, giving vision, giving knowledge. Jhana leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to awakening, to nibbana. Notice how the suttas never talked about how you will want to emerge from jhana as a concentration state and then proceeded to practice insight. The suttas never tell us that. The suttas simply say that jhanas are liberative in their own right. They're not just a platform, giving rise to something more important, i.e. insight. Jhana is a practice involving the transforming of your insight, your attitude, your relations, the way you relate to experiences, and so forth. Samyutta Nikaya 53.1 to 12, the whole 13 suttas says something to the effect of, just as the river Ganges slants slopes and inclines toward the ocean, even so jhana slants slopes and inclines toward nibbana. There are a whole bunch of Anguttara Nikaya suttas that even describe jhanas as nibbana themselves, or as semblance nibbana. And that would only make sense if you understand jhanas as inclining toward nibbana, as providing you with hints, with at least some measure of flavors of nibbana. Right? SN 43.3 tells us that jhanas is the path leading to the unconditioned. Digha Nikaya 29 and Durgagama 17 tells us jhanas lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, peace, superlative realizations, right awakening and unbinding. Right. SN 53.45 to 54 tells us that jhanas take us all the way to non-returnership, to arahathood, to full liberation in its own right. Right? It's not just, a practice in a separate compartment, dealing exclusively with concentration.